Okay. Okay. Start.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. This week in the Chutz La'aretz, we read Parsha Shlach in Eretz Yisrael. I just came back from Eretz Yisrael. We read Parshas Korach, and we'll try. There are a number of people from Eretz Yisrael that listen to the shir, and of course there are people in Chutz La'aretz that listen to the shir. So where it's possible, I will try to somehow speak about both sedras. Now, this week's sedra concludes with the Parsha of Tzitzis, Vayomer, the Parsha, the concluding Parsha that we say in Kriyas Shema every morning and every evening. And at the end of the Parsha, Rashi cites Miyisodo shel Moshe Darshan Hatakti. He quotes an explanation or an approach to the mitzvah of Tzitzis, as it's mentioned in the Torah in this parsha, in the name of Rav Moshe Darshan. He's saying he's writing over what Rav Moshe Hadarshan says. And basically, Rav Moshe Darshan was obviously somewhat intrigued between the connection of Parshas Tzitzis and the concluding verse of the Sedra, Ani Hashem Elokeichem Asher Hotzeisi Eschem Me'eretz Mitzrayim Lios Lachem Le'elokim Ani Hashem Elokeichem Emes. And Rav Moshe Darshan goes on to say that the before the Parsha of Tzitzis, so the Torah tells us about a person who is Makoshe Sheitzim, who is doing Malacha and Shabbos, and that was considered a capital offense. And then we have the Parsha of Tzitzis. He says that the reason the Torah tells us about Shabbos is because Shabbos is that someone who is Oved Avodah Zarah, because beforehand we talk about the being Oved Avodah Zarah. So someone is Mechalel Shabbos, someone who violates the Shabbos, it's like he does idolatry, and because Shabbos is equivalent to the whole Torah, violating the prohibition of idolatry is equivalent to violating the whole Torah. And then Parsha Tzitzis talks about the Tzitzis reminding us of all the mitzvos of the Torah. So there is a certain identification that these three mitzvos are somehow identified, each in its own way, with all the mitzvos of the Torah. And then he goes on to say the tzitzis is placed at the four corners of a garment that has four corners. Why? Because the four corners, according to Rav Moshe Hadarshan, corresponds with the four Lashonos of Gula, the four expressions of freedom that are mentioned in regard to Yetzias Mitzrayim in Parshas Va'era. V'hotzeisi, I will take you out from Egypt. from the under the bondage of Egypt. V'Itzalti, and I will save you. V'Gealti, I will redeem you. V'Lakachti, and I will take you as a nation. So that's why Tzitzis is identified with the four corners. And he says, why are there 8 strands on the Tzitzis? He says the reason there are 8 strands on the Tzitzis is because the Jewish people, from the time of the Exodus, from the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, from the time of their delivery from Egypt, from that time, it took 8 days. It took 8 days till they finally said the Shira. Till the Jewish people sang the Yashir. When at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, at the time of the splitting of the sea. Now, all the Mefarshim are baffled because Rashi here, quoting Moshe Hadarshan, says that the Jewish people sang Daz Yashir on the 8th day from the Exodus. Whereas Rashi in Parsha Shlach, and Rashi in the Gemara and Megillah, in explaining why we read the Shira on the 7th day of Pesach. Rashi says that the Jewish people actually said the Shira on the 7th day of their deliverance. So there seems to be a contradiction. On one hand, Rashi in Parsha Shlach seems to say that it's the Rashi in Parsha Shlach seems to say that it was on the 8th day that they sang the Shira, that they sang the Yashir, the song of gratitude to God. And Rashi in Parshas B'Shalach says that they sang it on the 7th day. Now the Mizrahi, in his Perush on Rashi, in his commentary on Rashi, he says something very strange. And he says that Rashi himself held that they sang the Shira on the 7th day. However, Ramosha Darshan had a different opinion. And Rashi in B'Shalach, Rashi in Shlach is only quoting the opinion of Moshe Darshan. He's not in agreement with him. That's difficult for many reasons. One reason it's difficult is because Rashi doesn't say that he disagreed with him. That's first of all. And secondly, if you read the Rashis, it appears that Rashi ended his Perush, ended his commentary on the Sedra, and then he quotes from Moshe Darshan. So on psukim that are earlier in the Sedra. So it's very difficult, not that it can't be answered. I think I have an answer. I won't go into it now. But Rashi is very difficult from along the lines that are suggested by the Mizrahi. The Gurarye, that's the commentary of the Maharal. He suggests that the reason to answer the question, he says, the beginning of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the beginning of the Exodus took place Erev Pesach, the day of the 14th of Chatzos at midday, because that's when the Jewish people took the God of Egypt the lamb, and they slaughtered it. So to a certain degree, there was a certain sense of freedom. They were no longer felt servile to their former masters. But the end of the Gula, I shouldn't say the end of the Gula, the process of leaving Egypt might have began on the 14th, but it was completed on the 15th, in the morning of the 15th, when the Jewish people actually left Egypt. So he said, if we view Yetzias Mitzrayim, if we view the Exodus from the moment it began, then the Jewish people sang the Shira on the 8th day. But if we count the days from the time they actually left Egypt, which took place the morning of the 15th of Nisan, then the Shira was sung on the 7th day from the Exodus. It was the 8th day from the beginning of the Exodus, and the 7th day from the end of the Exodus. And it is corresponding with those 7 days or 8 days that the Jewish people, in a sense, became free to some degree and did not sing Shira. That we have 8 strands of tzitzis at the corner of our 4-cornered garment. Now, we have to understand. Now, I want to suggest another possible explanation. But in doing so, I want to answer some other questions. The Torah tells us, the Rambam in Sefer Mitzvos mentions the Gemara in Brachas. The Gemara in Brachas says that one is prohibited from eating before davening shacharis. And the Gemara mentions lo sochlu al adam, do not eat on the blood. In other words, because to a certain degree, when we daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we're davening for our lives. So one should not eat before davening. Now, the simple reading of the Gemara, and that would probably be the sheet of most Rishonim, is that this is a rabbinic prohibition. The fact that the Torah mentions a pasuk, it's an asmachta. Very often we have rabbinic prohibitions that the Chachamim identified with psukim. Why did they identify it with psukim? There are all kinds of explanations. One explanation is because in that time, in the earlier years, before the Gemara was completed, you were not allowed to learn the Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral tradition, from a written text. And the people were very well versed in the written text of the Torah. So the Chachamim associated their takanos, their gzeros, the rules that they established, the laws that they decreed, with psukim, Not that there was a real connection between these decrees of the rabbis and the psukim, but the psukim served as a reminder to tell the Jewish people what the decrees were. Others say no, that these are drashos that enabled the Chachamim, that served as permission to the Chachamim, to the rabbis, to establish certain takanos. The rabbis couldn't establish takanos, could not establish new rules, new decrees, unless it had a basis in the Torah. But whatever it is, according to the simple explanation of the Gemara, it's only a rabbinic law. And if you look in the poskim, there are all kinds of exceptions made. Certain things a person is allowed to drink. Water is a person is allowed to drink. There is a discussion about coffee in the poskim. So, and of course, if somebody is sick or weak, there are all kinds of discussions when and how it's permitted. But the Rambam in the Sefer Mitzvos, when he talks about a lavsha b'chlalos, he says that this prohibition of eating before shacharis is a din d'oraisa. It's a biblical mitzvah. Now, this is somewhat difficult. Now, there is a dispute between the Rambam and the Ramban. I've mentioned it many times. The Ramban's opinion is that there isn't a requirement to daven every day, only in times of tzara. If there is a war, if there's a famine, there's a requirement to daven, there's a requirement to beseech God for help. But under normal circumstances, yes, Reb Chaim says there is a mitzvah, you fulfill a mitzvah anytime you daven. But on a biblical level, according to the Ramban, according to Nachmanides, there isn't a requirement to daven. However, the opinion of the Rambam is that there is a biblical requirement to daven every day. But once a day. Now we know, according to Jewish law, the day begins with the night. Now, if the day, let's Shabbos. When does Shabbos begin? Shabbos begins Friday evening. So if the day begins with the night, so there is a requirement to daven. If the requirement to daven is once a day, so a person has to daven once from the beginning of one night till the beginning of the next night. Anytime during that period, a person is required to daven. But he is required to daven during that period. So the question is, why is the prohibition of eating before davening, the eraser prohibition, the biblical prohibition, according to the Rambam, of eating before davening, only before shacharis, if the day begins with the night. If the day begins with the night, so there should be a biblical prohibition to eat before Ma'ariv. It doesn't mean that you have to daven Ma'ariv. Tfilas Harvest is Rishus. But there is a din of davening once during the day. And on the D'Oraisa level, on a biblical level, there is no difference between night and day, except that the day begins with the night. So the prohibition of eating before davening should start from when the beginning of the requirement of davening takes effect, when the requirement of davening begins to take effect. So that's one question. And then we have another question. We know the Gemara in Bracha says, this question whether there's a dispute or in the conclusion of the Gemara, everybody agrees to it. Avram tikein tfilas shacharis. Avram instituted the davening of shacharis. Yitzchak tikein tfilas mincha. Yitzchak instituted the davening of mincha, of the afternoon prayer. And Yaakov instituted Tfilas Harvest, Ma'ariv, the evening prayer. Now, logic would dictate that if the day begins with the night, if the day begins with the night, so Abraham, who is the first of the Avos, the first of the patriarchs, the first one to institute a requirement of davening, he should have been the one to institute Tfilas Harvest, because the day begins with the night. Now, there is a simple answer that could be given, and that this is not going to contradict. On the contrary, ultimately will support what I'm going to say, but that is, according to the Makna was, I think, the Rabbi of one of the Rebbeim, one of the teachers of the Chassam Sofer. He was from the early Hasidic halachic giants, although he himself was very much influenced by Hasidus. I think he was a student of the Mizritcha Maggid, and the Mizritcha Maggid was a student of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidus. But he didn't push so much the Hasidus as, let's say, as did the Balatanya. And so he said, in explaining many Gemaras, he says, before Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah at Sinai, the day began with the day, not with the night. It's only at Sinai that the day began with the night. So if we say that, so we can understand Avram tikein tfilas shacharis, because in the time of Avram Avinu, the day began with the day. So Avram instituted tfilas shacharis at the beginning of the day. I want to suggest that perhaps we could say that when Avram instituted tfilas shacharis, he instituted, it wasn't just shacharis. He instituted that every day a person should daven. And he instituted that in davening every day, you should daven at the beginning of the day. That you should begin your day with davening. It's possible. It's not compelling, but I don't know that it was necessarily tfilas shacharis, but he ipso facto he instituted Tefillah Shacharis because he said you should daven every day. You should daven every day, and you should daven every day as early as possible. Okay, but so since Avram instituted at a time that the day was halachically considered to begin with the day, so Shacharis it became the Tefillah of Avram remained Tefillah Shacharis, the davening of Shacharis, of the morning prayer. Now, I want to suggest, take this a step further and say something else, and perhaps we could suggest that in regard to certain things, although it was changed according to Ramachna, originally davening the day began with the day, and then was changed to begin with the night at the time of Matan Torah, at the time of the giving of the Torah. But in certain areas, the Torah felt that we should still treat the day as beginning with the day and not with the night. One case would be in regard to Avodah, in the service of the Beis HaMikdash. So there, in the service of the Beis HaMikdash, the day begins with the day and not with the night. And especially in regard to the karbanos, in regard to those sacrifices that correspond with tefillah, that correspond with davening, the way the Rambam explains it, Rashi explains it a little different. Rashi said, the Rambam says, tefillah shacharis, the davening of shacharis corresponds with the carbon tamid, with the daily sacrifice that was given in the morning. Tfilas mincha corresponds with the daily sacrifice that was given in the afternoon. And Ma'ariv corresponds, the Gemara tells us, with the burning of the fats and limbs, according to the Rambam, of the carbon tamid, of the daily sacrifices of Shacharis and Mincha. So you have like this, you have the daily sacrifice of Shacharis, in which the animal was slaughtered and the blood was sprinkled on the altar. You had the daily sacrifice of Mincha of the afternoon, in which the animal was slaughtered in the afternoon and the blood was sprinkled on the altar in the afternoon. And then the limbs and the fats of those two karbanos, of those sacrifices, was a carbanola. They were burnt afterwards on the altar. And if it wasn't put on the altar earlier, it could be put on the altar even in the evening, even at nightfall. And it's corresponding that halacha that it was on the altar at nightfall, that the tefillah service, the evening tefillah, was enacted. So, in other words, you see, it starts with the slaughtering and the sprinkling of the blood of the daily morning sacrifice, then the daily mincha sacrifice, and then the burning of the fats and limbs, which could even be done in the evening at night. So clearly, the act those things that were involved in the carbon tumid began in the morning and was concluded at night. So the day begins with the day, and in regard to kachim, and not at night. Now, so I want to suggest, so just like in regard to kachim, the day begins with the day and concludes with the night. So too, a matter of fact, it's mentioned in the Gemara and Brachas that the burning of the limbs could be completed throughout the whole night. So so we see from here that when it comes to the sacrifices to kachim, the day begins with the day and ends with the night. I want to suggest the same thing is true in regard to tefillah, in regard to the mitzvah d'oraisa tefillah, because where do we see the mitzvah? How does the Torah tell us about the mitzvah tefillah? Va'avadtem, and you shall serve. The same word that is used in regard to karbanos, avoda, service of God, both tefillah, davening, and karbanos is identified as avoda, as a form of service of God. And that perhaps is the reason why the Chachamim instituted that the Shemona Esrei, the davening, should correspond with some of the sacrifices. So just like the avoda, the day begins with the day and not with the night, so too, when it comes to davening, the day begins with the day and not with the night. Since the day begins with the day and not with the night, so we can understand why the prohibition of eating before davening, even if it's a biblical law, as the Rambam felt, that applies to shacharis. If someone doesn't daven shacharis, it will apply to mincha. If someone doesn't daven mincha, it will apply to the ma'ariv that comes at that night. But in regard to davening, the day of davening begins with the day and ends with the night. And I want to suggest that, and this perhaps we could also suggest, Avram Tikein Tefillah Shacharis, the first tefillah, because in regard to davening, that is the law. The day begins with the day. We don't have to come on to the thought of the Makna, that originally the day began with the day before Matan Torah, even without that, even if we don't assume like the Makna. But when it comes to davening, when it comes to avoda, the day begins with the day and not with the night. Now, and I want to suggest that perhaps this is also the case in regard, and I want to explain why. In regard to the Tzitzis and the Yashir, the day is based on the day should be seen from the perspective of beginning with the day and concluding with the night, rather than beginning with the night. And I think the reason is because the day of avoda, the day of servitude, when we view it from a servitude perspective, the day begins with the day and ends with the night. Now the question is, what does the Yashir have to do with servitude? What does the Yashir have to do with servitude? What does the Tzitzis have to do with servitude? We understand what tefillah has to do with servitude. We understand what korbanos have to do with servitude. But what is the relationship between the day of servitude that begins with the day and concludes with the night, have to do with the Yashir and with the Tzitzis? Now, at the beginning of Parshas Korach, which comes immediately after the Parsha of Tzitzis, the Medrash raises the question, right? That what is the connection between Parshas Tzitzis and Parshas Korach? And the Medrash tells us that Korach, in a sense, in order to instigate his dispute with Moshe, he said to Moshe Rabbeinu, he said, Moshe, if a person wears a beged, wears a cloth, wears a four-cornered garment that's kulat chelis, that is painted blue with the blood of the chalazon, does it require tzitzis or doesn't it require tzitzis? Now, in theory, we know, of course, today there is some dispute whether we have tchelis or not, but under ideal circumstances, 1, 2, or 4 of the 8, there's a whole dispute of the 8 strands has to be painted blue. And according to Rashi Shita, it's a dark blue, like the sky in the evening. According to the Rambam, it's blue like midday. Now the question is, what is the connection? What is the connection between the Tzitzis and Parshas Korach? But Korach said to Moshe, if a beged is kulo shel chelis, it's all blue, why should it have tzitzis? So so Moshe said, if that's the halacha is that it requires chelis, that it requires tzitzis. Even if the beged is completely blue, it requires tzitzis. So Moshe Rabbeinu, so it was Korach made fun of Moshe, and he took the 250 Rashi Sanhedrios. Now it seems from many Medrashim and from the Gemaras that the custom at that time was that the judges who sat at hearings or at Dintoris, they would wear a talis and they would cover their face almost with the talisim. So he took Rashi Sanhedrios. Korach had this special ability to draw leaders of Klal Yisrael to his side, and he gave them talisim that were completely blue and didn't have any tzitzis. And this was the opening of the rebellion against Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, let us understand it in a medrash manner. What was the argument between Moshe and Korach? Korach said, if it's all blue, it shouldn't require tzitzis. And Moshe said, no. Regardless if the beged is blue, it does require tzitzis. What was the argument? The argument was at this point. What does the blue symbolize? Blue symbolizes royalty in halacha. When Mordechai, not that that's a halacha, but in ancient times, the halacha was expressive of what the facts were at that time. In ancient times, royalty was identified with chelis, with blue. When Mordechai was assistant to the king, when he was appointed in place of Haman, so he went out with blue clothes. Chelis was one of the colors he wore. Even today, there's a form of blue that's called royal blue. It wasn't necessarily the same shade of blue, but blue was identified with royalty. Now we, Jews, have a double role. On one hand, we B'nai B'chorim Yisrael, we are the eldest children of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We are royalty. On the other hand, we are servants of God. What does the Tzitzis, what does the Tzitzis symbolize? The Tzitzis is at the four corners of the garment. What do the four corners represent? And here I'm going to suggest something a little different than just what Rabbi Moshe Darshan said. I think the four corners represent everywhere. East, west, north, south. And who is everywhere? HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God is everywhere. And the tzitzis that we wear, which symbolizes the mitzvahs of the Torah, in a sense, ties us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A servant is tied to his master. The tzitzis represents our being tied to God. It represents our obligation of serving of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of being in his service, of servitude to him. The tchelis, the blue, on the other hand, is indicative of royalty. Korach, he sought leadership. The Medrash tells us that what caused him to lead his rebellion against Moshe, because he wasn't appointed as a Nasi. He wasn't appointed as a prince. And the blue symbolizes position. It symbolizes power. He was interested, Korach was interested in royalty. Moshe Rabbeinu said, yes, we are royalty. We are the children of God. But in being the children of God, that has to be coupled with being the servants of God. The royalty has to be on the tzitzis, on the strands that tie us to God, that declare that we are God's servants, not just the prince of God, but we are the servants of God as well. The two go hand in hand together. That was the argument between Korach. Korach said, if I am royalty, I cannot be servitude. I choose royalty. I don't want to wear tzitzis. I don't want the strands that declare me a servant. I only want to be royalty. I want to beg it kulo shel tcheles. I want the clothes should be completely indicative of royalty. Korach wanted royalty without servitude. Moshe said, no, in our relationship with God, the two have to go hand in hand. And I think that to a certain degree, this is what the tzitzis symbolizes. In other words, yes, there is royalty, but it's indicative of our servitude, of being servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Consequently, it's identified with the day, beginning with the day and concluding with the night. So I think, and now the Medrash says that why are there 8 strands on the tzitzis? Because the Jewish people did not sing the Jewish people did not sing the Shira till the 8th day. Why didn't they sing the Shira till the 8th day? Why didn't they sing the Shira immediately when they left Egypt? Because what happened? And the Yashir Moshe Yashir Ashira la Hashem ki goa goa sus v'rofa rama v'yam. Why am I singing the Shira? I think the Jewish people are not just saying, why am I singing the Shira now? They were explaining themselves. Why am I singing the Shira now? Why didn't I sing it before? I'm singing the Shira now because now, yes, I was freed 7 or 8 days ago. But only now do I fully feel free. Because so long as I was running away from Egypt, I was looking back. Maybe Paro will come running after me, as he did. But now, sus v'rochvo rama v'yam. Not only the Egyptian soldiers were killed, but their horses were killed as well. Paro no longer has that ability to run after me. Even I, who perhaps did not have the proper approach at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, at the time of the Exodus, but I can finally throw the mental ropes, the mental chains that Paro had on me even after I left Egypt, and declare that I am free. And once I am free of Paro, who replaces Paro as my master? HaKadosh Baruch Hu replaces Paro as my master. The two go hand in hand. We can only be free of Paro if HaKadosh Baruch Hu becomes our master. And we can only be servants of God if we rid ourselves of being the mental servants of Paro. So the Jewish people on the 7th or 8th day from Yetzias Mitzrayim, only at that point were they able to psychologically sing the Shira, because the Shira is a song of freedom. I am free. Now, what was the purpose? What was the purpose of the servitude of Paro? The purpose of the servitude of Paro was, in a sense, to learn how to be servants. We went from the servitude of Paro into the servitude of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is the idea of the tzitzis, of the 8 strands of the tzitzis. The 8 strands of the tzitzis is symbolic of the fact that it took 8 days after I left Egypt to get rid of the servitude of Paro. But in doing so, I became tied to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I became the servant of God, because the Yashir could only be sung when I became fully free, when I recognized that I was free. So, and the truth of the matter is, I mentioned this, the Yerushalmi The Yerushalmi tells us that why are there 4 cups? One lashon is because of the four expressions of freedom, that the 4 expressions of freedom that are mentioned in Parshas Veira. Another it says because 4 times it says v'kos pari b'yadi, the cup of Paro, the Sar Hamashkin, when he told his dream over to Yosef. So he talked about there was mention in the Torah of the cup of Paro being in his hand with the 4 cups. Cup of Paro. 4 cups. We're celebrating our freedom. That's not the cup of Paro. But the answer is, we went from the service of Paro into the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The cup of Paro in our hand, that represents serving Paro. But now when we hold those 4 cups, they're kos shel bracha. They are the cups of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we are holding. We are holding the cups of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the idea is the tzitzis represent this idea of going from the servitude of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the servitude of Paro, into the servitude of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Therefore, in talking about the tzitzis, in terms of the Yashir, and talking about the Yashir, we talk about, when we couple the 2 together, the tzitzis with the Yashir, we talk about the day beginning with the day and ending with the night, because the day of servitude begins with the day and ends with the night. However, when the Gemara in Megillah and the Rashi in Shlach says the Shira was on the 7th day, there we're talking about, we're not talking about tzitzis, which represents servitude, and we're looking back, and from the perspective of the future, we see 7 days as beginning with the day, as beginning with the night and ending with the day. So the Jewish people, the Jewish people, Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt began. When did it begin? The night of the 15th. So the night of the 15th, from the perspective of the day beginning with the day, that was the first day. The day of the 15th, that was the 2nd day. So it's 8 days. However, when it comes to looking back, when we're not dealing with abdus, when we're not dealing with servitude, we're only looking at it from the perspective of freedom. So then the Shira was on the 7th day, because the night of Pesach and the day of Pesach constitute the first day. Because in that situation, when we look back, the day starts with the night and ends with the day. Okay. Yeah.
Any questions? Put them in the chat. I don't see any questions. Daniel, do you see any questions?
There was a question there. Huh?
No, I was mentioning of the Avodas HaKorbanos by Rav Kagan from the Chavetz Chaim.
Chavetz Chaim son-in-law, yeah.
Yeah, he said he detailed, easy to understand explanation of the daily procedures in the Beis Hamikdash. So, okay, so it's original Sefer with English translation published by ArtScroll, and it's available everywhere. But that wasn't really a question.
Okay.
A cross reference.
Okay. It's worthy to get.
So Danny Torchman asks, Saim Paro Meitzig Esa Yetzer Hara.
Yes, he does. The Rambam says that. The Rambam in the Igros, there are those who claim that that letter was forged, but I don't think so. The Rambam in the Igros, in a letter to his son, Rabbeinu Avram, says that that Paro is the Yetzer Hara. The one thing I didn't emphasize, and I should have emphasized, is that when it's 8 days, it's 8 days because the day begins with the day and ends with the night, and the first and Yetzias Mitzrayim is to be seen not from when they left Egypt, but to be seen from when the Makas Bechoros took place, the night of Pesach, which is the way we celebrate Pesach. The main thing is the night.
Okay. I don't see any other questions from Moshe. I don't know if Daniel, you see any more questions? He does not seem to have any more questions.
Okay.
So, okay, well, thank you.
Questions? I don't see anything else. So.
Okay, Moshe, thank you very much for
Thank you.
a lovely shir. Hope to be with you again next week for another great shir.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Be in touch.
Okay.
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 Rabbi Lazowski, can you press to end the recording, please?
Yes, sir.